The photograph was wrong. Arbiter Prime Vaseth noticed it before the chamber had finished pressurizing, a small thing mounted behind the human delegation's table where ceremonial images were permitted. Not a flag, not a seal, a photograph of something underwater. Dark shapes, barely visible through deep black water, arranged in a formation that made no organizational sense. Dozens of them, perhaps more. The image was so dark it was almost nothing. And yet Vaseth found himself staring at it while the atmospheric processors hummed and the other council delegates settled into their gravity cradles. He looked away. The humans were filing in, faces composed, hands empty as the disarmament accord required. He did not look at the photograph again. He should have. The accord had been inevitable, everyone said. 17 cycles of surveilling this species, and the consensus across all 9 council species was the same. Humans were young, volatile, and catastrophically overarmed relative to their developmental stage. The mathematics were not complicated. A civilization capable of interstellar travel but still governed by competing factions, still carrying unresolved historical violences, still biologically wired for tribalism. Such a civilization holding a weapons inventory at that scale was not a partner. It was a liability. The Council had dissolved younger civilizations for less. What made the accord different was that humanity had agreed. Not immediately, not without negotiation, but they had signed. That was the first thing nobody quite understood. The human ambassador's name was Lena Vasquez. She was small by human standards, which made her very small by galactic standards, and she wore no rank insignia, which the translation protocol flagged as either a deliberate political choice or a filing error. Vaseth had reviewed her file 3 times. Former naval officer. 12 years in a branch of the human military designated as a submarine service. Vessels that operated beneath the surfaces of oceans. Unseen, undetected, running silent through crushing pressures that would destroy most materials. She had spent 12 years learning how to disappear. He had found that detail strange when he first read it, then filed it away as irrelevant background. Now, watching her settle into her chair with a particular kind of stillness, not nervous stillness, not the stillness of someone suppressing emotion, but the stillness of someone who had been trained to wait in the dark. He found it strange again. "Arbiter Prime," she said, and her voice through the translator carried no detectable stress markers. "The Earth Disarmament Commission is prepared to begin the inspection sequence." Ambassador Vasquez. Vaseth inclined his primary sensory cluster in the appropriate gesture. "The Council appreciates humanity's continued cooperation." She smiled, small, precise. "Of course," she said. Later, much later, Vaseth would replay that smile through 17 different emotional analysis programs. None of them would agree on what it meant. The inspection teams deployed to Earth in the 43rd rotation after the signing ceremony, and for the first 2 rotations, everything proceeded according to projections. Humanity's declared surface armaments were cataloged, tagged, and placed into Council-monitored storage. Orbital weapons platforms were deactivated on schedule. The atmospheric defense grid went dark in sequence sections, each section verified by 3 independent Council observers before the next was cleared. The human military liaisons were cooperative, thorough, and almost suspiciously well-prepared, documentation pre-organized, access codes pre-authorized, personnel pre-briefed. Council inspection teams had conducted 47 disarmament operations across galactic history. None had proceeded this smoothly. Senior Inspector Dorath Vel, a Keth, species known for pattern recognition, calm under pressure, and deep skepticism of anything convenient, submitted a flag on the 4th rotation. "The compliance rate is 99.2%, the flag read. "In our previous 47 operations, average compliance in the first inspection phase has been between 61 and 78%. Civilizations always hide something. This compliance rate is not a good sign. It means either we are missing things or they want us to think we are not. The Council Review Board noted the flag, rated it low priority, moved on. Doreth Vel did not move on. She requested additional deep scan authorization for the oceanic territories, specifically the deep ocean regions, below 4 kilometers, where the Council's standard scanning equipment operated at significantly reduced resolution. The authorization was denied. Oceanic regions had not been listed in the Accord's declared weapons inventory. Scanning them would constitute a breach of the Accord's sovereignty provisions. Vel submitted a second flag. The humans specifically did not list oceanic regions in their inventory. It read, "I am not certain this is an oversight." This flag was also rated low priority. 41 days after the Accord took effect, the first incident occurred. It was small, the kind of thing that, under different circumstances, would have been classified, resolved, and forgotten. A Council monitoring satellite in a mid-latitude orbit above the Pacific Ocean detected an anomalous pressure wave in the deep water below, the kind of displacement signature consistent with a very large object moving at significant speed through the thermohaline layer. The signature lasted 11 seconds and disappeared. The monitoring system logged it automatically. A low-level analyst on Vasith's staff named Corin noticed it during routine review. Corin sent a query to the Human Liaison Office. The response came back within the hour. Seismic activity, consistent with known fault line behavior in the region, no human activity involved. Corin accepted the explanation, added a note to the file, and moved on. 3 days later, a near-identical signature appeared off the eastern coast of a region humans called Norway, at a depth of 2,100 meters. Then another, 6 days after that, in what humans called the South China Sea. Corin noticed the pattern, sent it to Vasith. Vasith stared at it for a long time. Then he pulled up the photograph from the signing ceremony. Dark shapes in black water. He called Doreth Vel. "I need you to tell me," he said without preamble, "what you believe is in the Earth's deep oceans." There was a pause. In that pause, Vasith heard something that the translation matrix could not fully render, a quality of restraint, of a person choosing words with the precision of someone who has been thinking about a question for a long time and is now surprised to be asked it directly. "I believe," Vel said slowly, "that we are looking at the compliance report they wanted us to see." The deep scan authorization was granted 4 days later, after Vasith went above 2 review boards to the full council chamber. The scan took 11 hours. It covered 6 target zones in Earth's oceanic regions, the coordinates selected based on the pressure wave signatures Corin had catalogued. The scans returned nothing. Uniform ocean floor, no anomalous structures, no metallic signatures, no power signatures, nothing. Vasith stared at the scan results for a long time. Then he called Ambassador Vasquez. "We conducted a deep scan operation in your oceanic regions," he said, "with appropriate authorization, per the Accord's monitoring provisions." "I'm aware," she said. The scans returned no anomalous findings. "I know," she said. And there it was again, that precise, contained quality, the smile he couldn't hear but somehow felt through the translator. "Ambassador," Vasith said carefully, "I want to ask you a direct question." "Please." "Is there anything in Earth's oceans that was not included in your declared inventory?" The pause this time was shorter. "Arbiter Prime," Lena Vasquez said, "the Accord specifies that humanity must declare all weapons systems. We declared all weapons systems." He noticed what she had not said. He noticed it completely, and the realization moved through him like a cold current. "And things that are not weapons systems are not subject to declaration," she said softly, "per the Accord's own language." The line closed. Vasith sat in silence for a very long time. He had been part of the team that drafted the Accord's language. What followed in the next 3 weeks was, according to Doreth Vel's later report, the most accelerated intelligence reassessment in Council history, which is a polite way of saying that we had to entirely reconstruct our understanding of what we thought we were looking at. The pressure wave signatures, reanalyzed with the knowledge that the human military had a classified depotion program not covered by weapons declarations, resolved into something coherent, not seismic events, propulsion signatures. Specifically, propulsion signatures consistent with vessels using a form of hydrodynamic drive that Council science had theorized but never observed operationally. A drive that left almost no detectable wake, generated minimal acoustic signature, and could sustain significant speeds at depths where most detection equipment performed poorly. They were not weapons. They had never been designated as weapons. They were submarines. Hundreds of them, perhaps more, distributed through the Earth's deep oceans in a pattern that, once Vel's team mapped it out, was not random at all. It was a grid, a global grid, each vessel positioned at a calculated distance from every major population center on Earth's surface, every major industrial region, and every known Council monitoring satellite in low orbit. Not weapons. Platforms. They didn't disarm, Vel told Vasith, her voice carrying something he had never heard from a Keth before, something adjacent to what humans called awe. They relocated. They took everything that could be made mobile and they put it somewhere we couldn't scan, and they did it before we arrived, and they called the empty spaces compliance. That's not what they did, Vasith said. Vel paused. Explain. They showed us everything, Vasith said. Everything on the surface, everything in orbit, everything they expected us to look for. The compliance rate was 99.2% because they wanted it to be 99.2%. They wanted us to feel like we'd found the 0.8%, a few irregularities, small enough to be believable. They gave us the search. They controlled what finding the search felt like. Vel was quiet. The deep ocean program, she said finally. How long? Vasith had already asked. Had already received an answer from a human technical advisor who had been, unexpectedly, disturbingly, entirely forthcoming once the question was framed correctly. The oldest signatures we can date, Vasith said, suggest construction phases beginning approximately 60 years before first contact with the Council. 60 years. Before they had known other civilizations existed. Before they had any reason to hide from anyone. They had built a hidden armada before they had an enemy to hide it from. Why, Vil asked. And that was the question. That was the question that changed everything, because the answer, when it came, did not make the situation better. It made it profoundly, philosophically worse. The human technical advisor's name was James Okafor, and he had the specific energy of a man who had spent 30 years knowing a secret that he'd privately wanted someone to ask about. It wasn't built for you, he said, when Vasith posed the question through a secure channel. It wasn't built for the Council. We didn't know about the Council. Then why? Vasith asked. Okafor leaned forward. He had the kind of face that stored patience in unusual quantities, and he released some of it now. Do you know what the dominant strategic philosophy in human naval doctrine was for about 200 years before your people found us? He said. It was called second strike capability. The idea is simple. If an enemy hits you hard enough to destroy everything you have on the surface, every base, every installation, every missile, every plane, everything visible, you still need to be able to hit back. You need weapons that survive the first strike. Weapons that can absorb a catastrophic, civilization-ending blow, stay hidden, stay functional, and then respond. Vasith processed this. You built a fleet designed to survive your own annihilation, he said. We built a fleet that makes our annihilation not worth attempting, HFY said. "There's a difference." And when the council arrived, "We already had it," HFY shrugged. "It seemed worth keeping." The translation matrix rendered that last sentence with perfect fidelity. The casual, matter-of-fact quality of it, the complete absence of apology, worth keeping. As if centuries of second strike doctrine and decades of secret construction and a galaxy-spanning deception were simply a reasonable thing that one kept, the way one kept a useful tool. Vaseth closed the channel. He sat in the dark of his office and understood, for the first time, that every model he had used to understand humanity was wrong. Not imprecise, not incomplete. Wrong. The Council had looked at humanity and seen a young civilization, volatile, tribal, reactive, building weapons from fear. What they had not understood was that fear in humans did not produce paralysis or desperation. It produced engineering. It produced patience. It produced 60-year construction timelines and compliance rates of 99.2%, and ambassadors who sat in signing ceremonies with still hands and said exactly what was true while concealing everything that mattered. The emergency council session convened 48 hours later. The chamber held 9 species. By tradition, the session opened with a statement of facts, which Vaseth delivered in the flat, careful tone of someone who had not slept, and had spent the sleepless hours rehearsing how to say something that sounded impossible. When he finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the Veth representative, oldest species on the council, most measured, most difficult to disturb, said, "How many?" "Our best current estimate," Vaseth said, "is between 300 and 400 vessels, possibly more. The deep ocean regions we have not yet scanned represent significant uncertainty." Armament classification. Unclear. They are not classified as weapon systems under the Accord. Their actual capability is not something we can assess without access we do not currently have authority to demand. Another silence. "They signed the Accord," said the Drain representative, and something in the translation carried the particular helplessness of a question wearing the shape of a statement. "They did," Vaseth said. "They disarmed. They complied with the Accord's language precisely." "That's the same thing." "No," Doroth Vel said from her seat beside Vaseth. She had asked to speak. He had let her. "It is not the same thing. That distinction is exactly the thing we failed to understand." The Drain representative looked at her. "Explain." "The Accord required them to declare weapons systems," Vel said. "They declared weapons systems. It did not require them to declare everything else. We assumed that everything of strategic relevance would be classified as a weapons system. We designed the Accord based on that assumption." She paused. "The humans designed their fleet 60 years before we arrived, before any of this. They built it for a different purpose entirely, and the purpose it was built for is not prohibited by our Accord, because our Accord was written for the galaxy we understood, not the galaxy they live in." The Veth representative was quiet for a long time. "What is their purpose?" it asked finally. "If not weapons, if not aggression, what are those vessels for?" Vaseth thought about the photograph. Dark shapes in black water, barely visible. Dozens of them. No, not dozens. He understood now that the photograph had been a deliberate choice. Not a flag, not a seal, but something specific. Something Vasquez had wanted him to see, or not see, or almost see. "Survival," he said. "They're for surviving. They exist so that if everything else is gone, something remains. Not to strike first. To ensure that striking them first is never worth the cost." The Veth representative was silent for almost a full minute. When it spoke, it said something that the translation matrix rendered imperfectly, a phrase that lost nuance in the conversion, but which carried the general sense of a civilization that builds for its own death and does not call it despair. The Council did not order a second disarmament demand. The discussion was held. The votes were counted. The result was not unanimous, but it was decisive, and the reason it was decisive was not legal or strategic. It was something closer to instinct. You did not issue demands to something whose response to the possibility of annihilation was to spend 60 years building the means to answer from the bottom of the ocean. What the Council issued instead was a formal inquiry, a request, not a demand, for a joint assessment of the deep ocean fleet's status, capability, and intent, a request to understand. Ambassador Vasquez received the inquiry in her office on Earth and read it twice. Then she called Vaseth directly, which was unusual. Channels of that directness were not standard protocol. "I'll agree to the joint assessment on one condition," she said. "What condition?" "I choose who conducts it from the Council's side," she said. "I want Doreth Vel." Vaseth paused. "Why?" "Because she flagged the oceanic regions on the 4th rotation," Vasquez said. "And when they denied her authorization, she flagged it again. I want someone who keeps looking when the answer seems complete." "You were monitoring our internal flag submissions," Vaseth said. "Not a question." "We were monitoring a lot of things," she said, and then quietly, "So were you. The difference is you stopped when the scan came back clean." The line held for a moment. "We should have kept looking," Vaseth said. "Yes," Vasquez said, "you should have." Doreth Vel descended into the Pacific Ocean aboard a human vessel, a surface ship, deliberately chosen, the humans leaving no ambiguity about who controlled this approach. The vessel stopped at coordinates that meant nothing on any Council chart and a great deal on human ones, and Vel stood on the deck in a pressure suit while the ocean moved in its enormous, indifferent way around her. "How do they surface?" she asked the human officer beside her, a young man named Tors, who had the particular steadiness of someone who had spent time underwater and come back changed. "They don't," Tors said, "not unless they choose to." As if to illustrate, the water ahead of the vessel changed. No dramatic emergence, no sudden breach. The ocean simply altered, a darkening, a disturbance in pressure, a shape rising so slowly and so silently that Vel thought at first she was imagining it. It was enormous. It was much, much larger than any scan signature had suggested, and Vel understood in that moment that the pressure wave data had been the visible portion of a much more deliberately obscured reality. She was looking at a vessel that had been designed, from its first blueprint, to be seen only when it chose to be seen. It broke the surface without drama. No sound. A mountain of dark metal, shedding water in sheets, running lights barely visible, hull markings that were not flags but coordinates, latitude and longitude in human notation, which Vel later determined were the coordinates of the vessel's original construction site. They had put their home on the hull, so they would remember where they came from, even in the dark. "How long has this one been down here?" Vel asked. Tors thought about it. "This hull, 14 years of continuous deployment, one crew rotation every 8 months. They go down, they stay down, they do their duty." 14 years. "The record is 22, Tors said. "Different hull, crew of 112. They surfaced for resupply 6 times in 22 years, otherwise nothing, just depth." Vel stared at the vessel. "What do they do?" she said. "Down there for years in the dark." Tors looked at her with something she couldn't fully read. "They wait," he said. "They run drills, they maintain systems, they record logs, they sleep, they argue, they grieve when someone gets sick because medical evacuation from depth is," he paused. "They grieve, and they keep going." "For what?" Vel asked. "They would never have been used, there was no enemy." "There wasn't one yet," Tors said. The vessel in the water sat still, patient, dark. "They built it," Vel said slowly, "so they would never have to use it." "That's one way to look at it," Tors said. "What's another way?" "They built it so that if something came that they couldn't stop any other way," Tors looked at the hull, at the coordinates of the construction site etched into black metal, "they would already have an answer. Not a fast answer, not a clean answer, just an answer. Something that was still out there after everything else was gone. Something that could still say, not yet. Not yet. Vel turned the phrase over in her translator and found it rendered two ways simultaneously, which was unusual. The literal meaning, a negation of finality, and underneath it, something the translation matrix flagged as a secondary emotional register, a meaning carried by the word's human weight, its history, the specific sound of it spoken by people who had spent years in crushing dark water maintaining weapons they hoped never to fire. The secondary rendering read, "We are still here." The joint assessment took 41 days and produced a document of 912 pages, which Vel submitted to the Council with a cover note that read simply, "I recommend reading Section 7 first." Section 7 was titled, "On the Concept of Deterrence as Applied by a Species with No External Reference Frame." It was 11 pages long, and it argued, carefully and with extensive supporting evidence, that humanity had developed the doctrine of mutual assured destruction independently, without alien contact, without external models, purely through the recursive logic of their own conflicts, and had then, recognizing its stabilizing function, extended it to galactic scale before any galactic power had demanded they do so. The Council had spent 17 cycles studying humanity before first contact. They had missed this completely. The report noted, in its final paragraph, that the Deep Ocean Fleet had not been built in response to the Council's arrival. It had already existed. The question the Council needed to answer was not whether humanity would disarm. The question was, what did it mean that humanity had already solved, independently and silently, the same strategic problem that had required 3 galactic wars and 500 years for the Council's coalition to resolve? Vaseth received the report in his office and read Section 7 twice. Then he walked to the window of his office, which was not a window in the human sense, but a transparency that looked out over the Council Station's observation deck, and stood there for a long time. He thought about the photograph. Dark shapes in black water, barely visible, the image so dark it was almost nothing. He had looked at it and seen a photograph. He had dismissed it as ceremonial. He had never asked why, among all the images a human ambassador might choose to display, Lena Vasquez had chosen that specific one in that specific chamber on that specific day. He asked now. He sent the question directly to Vasquez. Her reply came 4 minutes later. "It's my crew," she wrote. 2009 to 2021. My submarine, that's us, running alongside a sister vessel at depth. I keep it because I want to remember what it's like to be in the dark with people who trust each other, and to know that everything depends on you not panicking." She had been in the photograph. She had been one of the dark shapes in the black water. She had brought it into the signing ceremony and placed it behind the table where humanity agreed to disarm. She had looked at the Arbiter Prime of the Galactic Council across a table in a pressurized chamber, and smiled that small, precise smile, and behind her, visible to anyone who thought to look, was 12 years of running silent through the dark. Not a message, not a threat. A reminder to herself that she knew what patience felt like from the inside. The Council emergency session that followed Vel's report lasted 6 days. 6 days of argument, of fear, of legal interpretation, of strategic modeling, of species who had governed the galaxy for millennia trying to locate themselves correctly in relation to a civilization that had quietly constructed an answer to extinction before extinction was on the table. At the end of it, the Council did not issue a demand, did not issue a sanction, did not attempt a second disarmament. What it issued was something unprecedented in Council history, a request for alliance, not a conditional partnership, not a monitored association, a formal, unqualified request extended from the oldest governing body in the explored galaxy to a species that had been in space for 19 years. The request was delivered to Ambassador Vasquez. She read it in the same office where she'd taken Vaseth's calls, and the young aide who was present later said she sat with it for a long time before she spoke. When she spoke, she said, "Get me Director Akafer and Doreth Vel on a joint channel, and someone get me coffee, because this conversation is going to take a while." She said nothing about the offer itself, not for several hours. When she finally responded to the council formally, through the appropriate diplomatic channels, her response was 4 sentences. Humanity is honored by the council's offer. We take alliances seriously. We take them more seriously than most because we have spent a long time understanding what it costs to face something alone. We will need to discuss terms. The terms took 8 months to negotiate. Humanity's primary point of insistence, which they maintained through every session regardless of pressure, was a single clause that the Deep Ocean Fleet would remain under Earth's sovereign command, not joint command, not monitored command. Sovereign. The Council agreed. Vel told Vaseth afterward that she had expected the negotiation to fail on that point, that she had considered it a potential deal-breaker. "Why did we agree?" she asked him. Vaseth thought about it for a moment. "Because they built it before we existed, for a reason that had nothing to do with us, and it kept them safe for decades without ever being used," he said. "Because the only time it was a threat was when we tried to make it one." He paused. "And because when I tried to imagine demanding that they give it up, I kept thinking about the photograph, about what it means to carry something into the dark and trust that you won't need it. I didn't want to be the reason they were wrong to trust that." Vel looked at him for a long moment. "You're afraid of them," she said, "not an accusation, an observation." "I'm afraid of the logic," Vaseth said. "The logic that built that fleet before any enemy existed. The logic that smiled across a signing table and said yes and meant yes completely and also meant something else entirely and wasn't lying about either one." He paused. "I have studied 47 civilizations. None of them ever thought far enough ahead to build against an enemy they hadn't imagined yet. Humans didn't just think that far ahead. They maintained it for 60 years. They crewed it. They sent people down into the dark for years at a time to keep it ready." "Because they were afraid," Vel said. "Because they turned fear into something that waited," Vaseth said. "There is a difference, and it is the most important difference in the galaxy, and I don't think any of us understood it until now." There is a photograph on the wall of the Council's new Human Liaison Office, in the building constructed after the Alliance Accord was formalized. It is the same photograph from the signing ceremony. Dark water, dark shapes, a formation that makes no organizational sense until you understand what you're looking at, and then makes perfect, terrible sense. Vel had asked for a copy, had framed it herself. Not as a trophy, not as a warning. As a reminder of what she had almost not seen. Of the 11-second pressure wave signature that a low-level analyst had almost not noticed. Of the 4th rotation flag that had almost been ignored. Of the gap between what a civilization declares and what a civilization is, and how much darkness can live in that gap, patient and maintained and ready, in the cold water where the light does not reach. The plaque beneath the photograph does not explain the image. Vel wrote it herself, in Council standard notation, and it says only this: "They did not build it to win. They built it so that losing was never the only option. Every civilization in the galaxy has enemies. Only one built its answer 60 years before it knew what the question would be. We asked them to disarm. They showed us everything we asked to see. We thought we understood what we found. We found the surface. Somewhere below the Pacific Ocean, in water so deep that no light has ever reached it naturally, a vessel runs silent and dark along a course it has run for years. Its crew rotates on schedule. Its systems are maintained with the particular care that comes from knowing that maintenance might matter in a way that changes everything. It is not a weapons system. it was never classified as one. It waits, the way things wait when they have been built by people who know that the universe does not announce its intentions. And the crews who serve on it, young men and women who go down into crushing dark and stay there, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. They do not think of themselves as the reason the galaxy does not test humanity. They think of themselves as doing their duty. They think of themselves as keeping the light on in a place where light doesn't reach. They go down. They wait. They trust that they will not be needed. And in that trust, in the discipline and endurance and sheer, irrational human insistence on maintaining a readiness for a catastrophe that may never come, the galaxy finds something it does not have a word for. Something that sits at the intersection of what a civilization is willing to endure and what it is unwilling to accept. Something that the Council, in 8 months of negotiations, never found a legal framework to contain. The Galactic Council ordered humanity to disarm. Humanity showed them everything. And in the space between what was shown and what was not asked for, in the cold dark of the deepest ocean, 300 vessels maintained their silent vigil. Not an armada, not by any technical definition, not a weapon by any clause of any accord ever drafted, just the long, patient, breathing answer to a question that had not yet been asked. Just in case. Just not yet.